When a simple traffic stop escalates into a defining challenge, a police officer's ingrained assumptions shatter against a reality he was never prepared to face. The man he targets is the very man who holds the officer's entire future in his hands. The sun began its slow, deliberate descent over the avenues of Sterling City, bathing the skyline in strokes of liquid gold and deep amber. Julian Vance was navigating the familiar route home, the day's pressures melting away as his sedan whispered along the asphalt. Inside the climate-controlled cabin, the air conditioner hummed a quiet tune, a counterpoint to the city's fading roar, while the radio murmured a soothing melody. As he approached an intersection, the traffic light shifted to a cautious yellow, and he eased his foot onto the brake just as it bled into a vibrant red. In that exact moment, his rearview mirror exploded with the searing dance of red and blue lights, the sudden shriek of a siren cutting through the evening's calm. Julian's brow furrowed in mild confusion as he guided the car to the curb, the engine settling into a soft idle. He lowered his window, watching as a police cruiser slid in behind him. From it emerged Officer Marcus Thorne, a man in his mid-30s, with a severe buzz cut and a badge that caught the last rays of the dying sun. Thorne hitched his belt, his approach a practiced swagger that spoke of a man accustomed to absolute control. "License and registration," Thorne clipped out, his voice a flat monotone, edged with the unmistakable steel of authority. Without a word, Julian complied, his movements measured and unhurried as he retrieved the documents from his glove compartment. He could feel the weight of Thorne's gaze, a palpable scrutiny that seemed to be searching for any crack in his composure, any excuse to pry deeper. "Do you have any idea why I pulled you over?" Thorne pressed, leaning his weight against the car door. "I can't say that I do, officer," Julian replied, his tone perfectly level, polite, yet unwavering. "You failed to come to a complete stop back at that light," Thorne stated, though a subtle flicker of uncertainty crossed his face. Julian's expression tightened for a second before he gave a slight nod. "I see. I believed I had slowed sufficiently, but I understand." Instead of concluding the stop, Thorne lingered, his eyes narrowing as he scanned Julian from head to toe. For him, this was no longer a matter of routine. His posture shifted, a minute but telling adjustment that broadcast his internal verdict. This was far more than a simple traffic violation. The officer's eyes dropped to the license in his hand. "You're not from Sterling City, are you?" he probed. Julian paused for a fraction of a second. "I relocated here several months ago. The address is current on the license." But Thorne wasn't truly listening, his questions beginning to sharpen, suggesting his interest had strayed far from the initial infraction. Julian's unnerving calm seemed to agitate him further. "Where were you racing off to in such a rush?" "I was simply on my way home," Julian answered, his voice remaining a steady, even current. But the atmosphere inside the car had grown thick, heavy with unspoken accusation. In Thorne's mind, Julian had transformed from a citizen into a subject of suspicion. Julian could feel the tension coiling between them, a tangible force, yet his calm resolve remained unbroken. Little did Officer Thorne comprehend, this placid exterior was not ignorance, it was absolute control. And this was only the beginning. Thorne took a deliberate step back from the vehicle, folding Julian's documents with a theatrical slowness before slipping them into his breast pocket. He drew himself up, a faintly smug expression solidifying on his face, the look of a man who has already passed judgment. "Step out of the car for me," Thorne commanded. For a brief instant, Julian's grip tightened on the steering wheel, but his expression remained a mask of neutrality. "Is there a particular reason for that request, officer?" he inquired, his voice perfectly modulated. A muscle twitched at the corner of Thorne's mouth. "I asked you to step out of the car," he repeated. "Let's not make this more difficult than it needs to be." The unspoken threat hung between them, as clear as the evening air. With a slow, controlled exhale, Julian opened the door. As he emerged, Thorne's eyes raked over him, taking his measure. Julian was slightly taller than the officer, with broad shoulders, yet he carried himself with an air of quiet confidence rather than menace. His tailored suit spoke of a professional life, his polished shoes a testament to a meticulous nature. None of it registered with Thorne. The officer gestured toward the hood of the sedan. "Place your hands where I can see them." Julian complied, his motions fluid and unresisting. "Is there something specific you are searching for, officer?" A smirk ghosted across Thorne's lips. "Just routine procedure. We've had some reports of incidents in this area. One can never be too careful." Julian angled his head slightly, his gaze locking with Thorne's. "Incidents involving professional men in sedans? Or is it possible this is about something else entirely?" The question struck its target with the force of a physical blow. For a moment Thorne's practiced composure faltered, his hand instinctively drifting toward the gear on his belt. "Watch your tone," he warned, his voice hardening. "I am merely asking for clarity," Julian replied, the quiet firmness in his voice serving only to further unsettle the officer. Thorne leaned in, invading Julian's space, his eyes narrowed to slits. "You seem to know your way around these proceedings. You have something you're trying to hide?" Julian allowed the silence to stretch, to hang in the air for a deliberate beat. "No, officer. I simply believe in transparency when it comes to interactions of this nature. It benefits everyone, you understand?" Thorne scoffed but offered no rebuttal, instead beginning to pace a tight circle on the pavement. The power dynamic was subtly inverting, shifting in ways he couldn't quite comprehend. Julian wasn't reacting as people were supposed to react. There was no fear, no stuttering, no nervous energy. There was only poise, control, and an unnerving tranquility that set Thorne's teeth on edge. "You're awfully confident," Thorne muttered, the words more for himself than for Julian. "Like you think you already know how this ends." Julian refused to take the bait, tilting his head slightly. "Confidence has nothing to do with this, officer. Respect does." Thorne froze mid-stride before turning back to face him, the smugness now replaced by a sharp, defensive posture. He opened his mouth to retort, but the words wouldn't form. Julian's absolute composure was a mirror, and Thorne did not like the reflection. As the silence drew taut, the air between them crackled with an electric tension. Thorne was beginning to grasp that this encounter was not going to unfold according to his script. But rather than retreat, he chose to escalate. The true test was about to begin. Officer Thorne tapped a restless rhythm against the holster at his hip, his frustration a barely contained force. He was unaccustomed to being questioned, particularly not by someone who looked like Julian. His gaze darted back to the sedan, as if willing it to provide the justification he was so desperately trying to invent. "Turn around, hands on the hood," Thorne commanded, his voice now clipped and sharp. "I need to conduct a search for weapons." Julian raised a single eyebrow. "Weapons?" he echoed, his tone laced with a calm incredulity. "Do I present as someone who would be carrying a weapon?" A muscle in Thorne's jaw jumped. "I am not going to repeat myself." For a moment Julian hesitated, an unreadable emotion flickering in his eyes. Then, without another word, he turned and placed his palms flat against the cool metal of his car. Thorne approached, the crunch of his boots on the asphalt, the only sound in the tense quiet. The officer's hands moved over Julian's body in a series of quick, rough pats, lingering just a fraction too long, a clear and clumsy attempt to assert dominance, to force a reaction. But Julian remained perfectly still, refusing to flinch, to stiffen, to grant him any satisfaction. "You're clean," Thorne grumbled, stepping back. The admission was coated in resentment, as if he were personally offended not to have found anything to validate his mounting suspicion. Julian turned to face him once more, his expression placid, but his eyes sharp as glass. "Of course I am," he stated simply. "Now, officer, if you are finished—" "I'm not finished," Thorne snapped, his voice rising, the words tumbling out in a rush to reclaim control. You seem to possess a great deal of knowledge about police procedure. Would you care to elaborate on that?" Julian folded his arms across his chest. His posture relaxed, despite the charged atmosphere. "I have had a number of encounters with law enforcement over the years," he said. "Let's just say I have learned a great deal." Thorne's eyes narrowed into slits. "What are you, some kind of lawyer?" A faint smile touched Julian's lips. "Or something." The deliberate ambiguity seemed to fuel Thorne's irritation. He stepped forward again, closing the distance until he was almost nose to nose with Julian, his voice dropping to a low growl. "Listen to me. You think you're clever, don't you? Think you can talk your way out of anything?" Julian met his hostile glare without wavering. "I don't think anything, officer. I simply believe in the principle of fairness, and frankly, I have seen very little of it here tonight." The statement landed like a gauntlet thrown down, and Thorne immediately stooped to pick it up. "Fairness? Is that what you think this is? About people like you always—" He cut himself off, but the poison of the unfinished sentence lingered in the air. Julian's expression remained unchanged, but a subtle shift in his stance, an almost imperceptible straightening of his spine, signaled that he had heard exactly what Thorne had left unsaid. "People like me?" Julian repeated, his voice soft, yet vibrating with unspoken meaning. Thorne bristled, taking an involuntary step back, as if realizing he had just stumbled across a line he could never uncross. "You know what I meant," he mumbled, his tone now hollow, stripped of its earlier conviction. "I believe I do," Julian replied, his voice quiet. But his calmness was no longer passive. It was a razor's edge, slicing through the officer's pretense. "And I believe we both know this interaction ceased to be about a traffic violation a very long time ago." Thorne opened his mouth, but no sound emerged. For the first time all evening, he looked utterly lost, adrift on a sea of his own making. The balance of power had irrevocably shifted, and Officer Thorne was standing on treacherous ground. The moment of reckoning was upon him, and it would be a moment he would never, ever forget. Julian's voice cut through the heavy silence, as steady and unyielding as granite. "Officer, I believe it's time you understood exactly who I am." Thorne's irritation flared anew. "I don't care who you are," he shot back, though the tremor in his voice betrayed him. With a slow, deliberate motion, Julian reached inside his suit jacket. "I'm reaching for my badge," he announced calmly, his eyes locked on Thorne's hand, which twitched instinctively near his weapon. "There is no need for alarm. I want you to see it clearly." The words hung in the air, weighted with profound significance. Thorne's gaze followed Julian's hand as it produced a fine leather wallet, flipping it open to reveal a gleaming official shield. "Out of Julian Vance," Julian said, his tone as casual, as if he were making an introduction at a dinner party. "Director of Internal Affairs, Sterling City Division." Thorne froze solid, his eyes darting from the brilliant badge to Julian's impassive face, desperately searching for some sign of a prank. He found none. There was no humor in Julian's expression, only a quiet, resolute authority and a trace of deep disappointment. "Internal Affairs?" Thorne echoed, the words cracking in his throat. "Yes," Julian confirmed, sparing him the effort of finishing. "I oversee the conduct of this department's officers. It is my responsibility to ensure that every individual who wears this shield embodies the integrity and the values it is sworn to represent." The color drained from Thorne's face, his carefully constructed bravado dissolving in an instant. He took a stumbling step backward, his hand falling from his belt as if the authority it represented had suddenly become a crushing weight. Julian closed the distance Thorne had created. "Do you understand what the most disturbing part of this encounter has been, Officer Thorne?" he asked, his voice calm yet piercing. Thorne remained silent, his face a mask of a man realizing he has wandered into quicksand. "It isn't the profiling," Julian continued, "though that is egregious enough. It isn't the baseless escalation either. It is the staggering fact that you have done all of this without the faintest idea of who you were speaking to. You made an assumption that I would be ignorant of my rights, that I would not understand the very laws you are sworn to uphold. And why? Thorne stood speechless, trapped in the harsh glare of Julian's scrutiny. Because I did not conform to your preconceived notion of someone who deserves respect, Julian finished for him, his words not angry, but carrying the immense weight of an indictment. And that is not merely a problem for me, officer. That is a problem for every single person you encounter while wearing that uniform. Thorne's shoulders slumped, the full impact of Julian's words landing on him like a physical blow. He glanced down at the shield in Julian's hand one more time, as if hoping it would vanish. Julian stepped back, granting him a moment of air. "Here is what is going to happen now," he said. "You are going to take another step back. You are going to return my documents, and you are going to think very, very carefully about your next words." Thorne's lips parted, a silent debate raging within him. The hesitation cost him dearly. Julian's voice lowered, becoming quieter, but infinitely more potent. "And you will be hearing from me again. Not as a driver you pulled over on a whim, but as the man whose job it is to decide if you are fit to wear that badge at all." Thorne swallowed hard, a dark flush creeping up his neck as the gravity of his situation finally settled in. He reached into his pocket and withdrew Julian's license and registration, his hands trembling as he extended them. Julian accepted them without comment, slipping them back into his wallet. He walked to the driver's side of his car, pausing with his hand on the door handle to look back at the officer one last time. "Remember this, Officer Thorne," Julian said, his voice carrying across the space between them. "The badge doesn't elevate you above anyone. It makes you accountable to everyone." As Julian slid behind the wheel and the engine purred to life, Marcus Thorne was left standing alone in the deepening twilight, his world shaken to its core, his future a terrifying unknown. But for Julian Vance, this was far from the end. His next move would send ripples through the entire department. The drive home was silent, a stark contrast to the storm of thoughts raging in Julian's mind. The encounter replayed itself, not because it was so shocking, but precisely because it was so familiar. Marcus Thorne was not the first officer of his kind that Julian had encountered, and he knew with grim certainty that he would not be the last. But this time was different. This time, Julian was in a position to do more than just endure. This time, he had the power to enact change. The following morning, early sunlight sliced through the blinds of Julian's office in the Sterling City Police Department's Internal Affairs Division. Open on his desk was a file, Officer Marcus Thorne. His service record was not clean, but rather a patchwork of minor complaints, unprofessional conduct, a pattern of questionable stops, a series of misunderstandings that had been quietly swept aside. Julian leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers as he considered the larger picture. Thorne was not an anomaly. He was a symptom of a much deeper institutional illness, and Julian had no interest in applying a bandage to a festering wound. A sharp knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. His assistant, Clara, entered with a stack of reports. "Good morning, Director Vance. Here is the summary of last month's misconduct filings. Also, Chief Corrigan's office called to remind—" "You about the departmental review next week?" Julian nodded, accepting the files. "Thank you, Clara. Could you please schedule a meeting for me with the chief this afternoon? Something has come up that requires his immediate attention." Clara paused, sensing the gravity in his tone. "Of course, sir," she said before quietly exiting the room. Julian's gaze returned to Thorne's file, but his mind was already moving beyond one officer. This was about the culture that not only permitted, but quietly encouraged a man like Thorne to behave as he did. And if there was one thing Julian understood, it was that culture flows from the top down. Later that day, Julian sat across a polished conference table from Chief Corrigan, a seasoned veteran, with salt and pepper hair and a direct, no-nonsense air. Corrigan leaned back, listening without interruption, as Julian recounted the previous evening's traffic stop. "I could have dismissed it as just one more unfortunate interaction," Julian concluded, his voice steady but firm. "But that would be a profound error. Officer Thorne's actions are not an isolated incident. They are a stark reflection of how much work we have yet to do." Corrigan rubbed his temples, letting out a slow, weary sigh. "This isn't the first time Thorne's name has crossed my desk," he admitted, "but it's always been handled internally, quietly." "And that is precisely the problem," Julian countered. "Quiet doesn't solve anything. Quiet allows the problem to persist and to grow. Chief, it is time for us to be loud." Corrigan looked at him, the weight of the moment etched on his face. "What are you proposing, Julian?" "A department-wide review," Julian stated without a moment's hesitation. "Not just of individual officers, but of our training methodologies, our field protocols, and our systems of accountability. We cannot continue to hide our failures in the shadows. If we do not hold ourselves to a higher standard, how can we possibly expect the community we serve to trust us?" Corrigan leaned forward, his hands clasped on the table. "You know this is going to ruffle a lot of feathers." "Good," Julian said simply. "It's about time someone did." The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of relentless activity. Julian worked tirelessly, poring over data, conducting interviews with officers of every rank, and establishing public forums to hear directly from the citizens of Sterling City. The incident with Officer Thorne became the undeniable catalyst, the tipping point that compelled the department to finally confront its deepest flaws. Thorne himself faced a formal internal hearing. Julian made his own involvement clear, sitting opposite the officer during the proceedings, observing as the man's bravado crumbled under the weight of official scrutiny. The hearing ultimately led to a lengthy suspension, but Julian knew the true victory was not in the punishment of one man. It was in preventing the rise of the next Thorne. Months later, Julian stood at a podium addressing a packed auditorium of police officers, city officials, and local residents. He spoke not of blame, but of shared responsibility, of the collective duty to forge a system of justice that served every single member of the community. His words were not just a call to action. They were a solemn promise of profound and lasting change. "Justice is not merely about pursuing those who break the law," Julian declared, his voice resonating with clarity and conviction throughout the hall. "It is about ensuring that the very people sworn to protect and serve carry out that duty with integrity, with fairness, and with unwavering respect for every person they encounter. That is the standard I believe in, and that is the standard we are going to build here, together." The applause that followed was thunderous, but Julian didn't dwell on it. For him, this was never about a single moment of triumph. It was the beginning of a better, more just story. As he stepped down from the stage, his eyes scanned the faces in the crowd. He saw skepticism, he saw hope, but most importantly, he saw that they were all listening. He knew that true change would not happen in a day, but he also knew with absolute certainty that it would happen. And, for now, that was enough.